And we have not one, but two panelists. Again, on Monday, we're not going to be stepping over the man who's been at the pool for 38 years and let him wait another 38. We're going to do something. We're going to be reducing some barriers. And these two panelists are going to show us how we can, some of the ways we can do that. So it's my pleasure to introduce Laura Strahlmeyer. She is the Policy and Advocacy Manager and formerly a Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellow at the Alliance for Peace Building with the Policy and Advocacy team. She works to lead, support, and empower members in advocating to the U.S. government and other institutions. She coordinates several topical working groups, leads congressional engagements, and manages administration outreach. Laura has supported a range of peace-building developments, academic and religious organizations, including the local peace-building organization. Never Again Rwanda. She holds an accelerated Master's of Public Affairs with concentrations in nonprofit management and international development from the School of Public Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. And you can find further information regarding her on page 12 of your bulletin. So let's give her a hand to welcome her. Oh, no, both of them.
Please welcome Marcia Johnson Blanco.
We're going to get this right.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of Ecumenical Advocacy Days and thanking you for the work you're going to be doing tomorrow as well. I have quite a lengthy presentation about voting, starting from the 15th Amendment. I'm going to take you on a journey, starting from the 15th Amendment to current day voter suppression. I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible to give you an opportunity to ask questions. First, I will start by, it's working, telling you a little bit about the Lawyers Committee. The Lawyers Committee was founded in 1963 when President Kennedy called the private bar to the White House to ask for help in the activity of the civil rights movement at that time. And from that meeting, the Lawyers Committee was organized by members of the private bar, and voting rights was at the forefront of that work. As I mentioned, I'm going to go back right to the beginning, well, close to the beginning. Thank you. And talk about the 15th Amendment, because really the 15th Amendment is when the country began to expand who can vote. As you all know, at the beginning of the country, while the founding documents were filled with the ideal of all being equal, it really wasn't until after the Civil War and the passage of the Civil War amendments, and in particularly the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to all men. We'll get to women a little later down the line. And stated that the right to vote cannot be denied because of race, class, or a previous condition of servitude. However, it wasn't until the passage of the Voting Rights Act that the 15th Amendment became realized. And the reason why is because after Reconstruction, I took out the part about Reconstruction because we didn't have enough time, but after Reconstruction, there were many efforts made to prevent those who were formerly enslaved from being able to vote. And that included literacy tests. And I just want to give an example, because a lot of these laws applied across the board but had a particular impact on those who were formerly enslaved. And it's really important to look at the impact of the laws, because while on the their face, they may seem that they apply to everyone equally. They have a disparate impact, particularly on minority populations. So an example of the literacy test, when I was doing the hearings for the National Commission in 2005, we had a congressman from Alabama who was part of the commission, and he was telling me what he had to do for his literacy test before the Voting Rights Act, and that was to name the first president of the United States. However, if you were African American, you had to memorize and cite code or be able to name all of the counties in your state. It was just a really onerous and lopsided test. We also had the poll tax, which was later eliminated. You had the character tests where those who were previously registered had to vouch for your character. If you have no one to vouch for your character, you couldn't get registered. And then, of course, we had harassment and violence and racially polarized voting, which I'll talk to a bit more. So while, again, the 15th Amendment said the right to vote could not be denied, there were very explicit statutes and procedures and practices that kept African Americans and other minorities from being able to vote. Okay, get a little closer. So the 15th Amendment took care of the men, and the 19th Amendment is when women were able to vote. But it's really important to look at who was able to vote when the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, and that was white women. And it wasn't until 1952 that Asian women could vote, 1957 when Native American women could vote, and then with 1965 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that African American women could vote. Before we got to the Voting Rights Act, we had the elimination of the poll tax. And the poll tax was basically what it says. It's you had to pay in order to be able to vote. And if you didn't have the money to pay in order to be able to vote, you couldn't vote. And this was in addition to all of the other barriers that I'd mentioned earlier. So in 1963, you had the very famous plans to march from Selma to Montgomery to fight to register to vote. There was a march that was planned by the civil rights leaders to walk from Selma to Montgomery to register to vote. And the reason why this march was so significant is not only that the marchers were set upon by the police and violently beaten, including Congressman John Lewis, but it was televised. And today we're aware of, with the cell phones and the camera phones, you can see the violence that you know is happening, but until it reaches a wide consciousness, it's hard to get people to move. And so this violence really shocked the nation, and President Johnson decided this was the time to introduce the Voting Rights Act. And one of the things that I have to say that's remarkable about the introduction and then the passage of the Voting Rights Act is that the Voting Rights Act was introduced in March of 1965, with President Johnson adopting the words of the civil rights movements and ending his speech introducing the act saying, "We shall overcome." And really, it's an example of the head of the country embracing the struggle that the people were fighting for. But what was even more remarkable is that it was introduced in March of 1965 and was signed into law in August of 1965. Can you imagine legislation today being introduced by both houses and being able for the president to sign that quickly? And President Johnson did note that it is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what the Voting Rights Act does and where we currently are. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act essentially mirrored the language of the 15th Amendment and said you cannot deny or abridge the right to vote. So you can't have laws that make it impossible for anyone to be able to vote, and then you can't also dilute their vote. You cannot undermine their opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. The thing about Section 2 is that it requires a lot of litigation in order to address the wrongs. And as I'll talk about a bit more, litigation takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. So in addition to Section 2, we have Section 5. And Section 5 looked at the jurisdictions with a history of discrimination in voting, and you see what those jurisdictions are there in red, and said that those jurisdictions had to submit any voting change for federal approval before they could be implemented. So that means they had to submit their voting change either to the Department of Justice or to the DC District Court in order for their voting change to be implemented, and those jurisdictions had the burden of proof. Under Section 2, those fighting against the barrier had the burden of proof to show that it is discriminatory. Under Section 5, the jurisdiction had the burden to show that what the change they wanted to make was not discriminatory. If they couldn't meet that burden, they couldn't implement that change. And so Section 5 was in effect from 1965 to 2013, when the Supreme Court in the Shelby County versus Holder decision effectively nullified Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by finding that the formula that determined these states that have a history of discrimination was unconstitutional. And I'll talk a bit more about that as well. Other provisions in the Voting Rights Act. Section 203, this is the minority language provision. It requires jurisdictions with a particular percentage of minority voters to have voting materials in their languages. And it looks at those minority language users that had a history of discrimination. So it applies to Spanish, Alaska Native, Native American languages, and Asian languages. And then you have Section 208. Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act requires those who need assistance to have their assistance of choice in order to be able to vote. Now, there's a carve-out for your employer or your union can't provide that assistance, but anyone else who you want to provide that assistance can provide that assistance of choice under Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. And this is also used for other language minorities who don't fit under the formula for 203. So for example, in Miami, those who speak Haitian Creole rely on Section 208 in order to be able to provide needed assistance at the polls. I'm going very quickly because I have a lot to cover, and I just wanted to give you this overview. So, you heard about my work in the Commission for the Reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2005. And essentially, because the Voting Rights Act, and particularly Section 5, provides what's called such an extraordinary remedy, requiring states who do constitutionally have the obligation to provide the qualifications for elections. And this is the federal government coming in and imposing this responsibility on the states who were covered under Section 5 to have their changes reviewed, this federal oversight. Because of that, the Section 5 needed to be reauthorized periodically. And Congress had to show that those states that were covered under Section 5 should remain covered. And Congress had to provide a record of that ongoing discrimination. And in 2005, at the Lawyers Committee, we looked around and we looked at the political climate at the time and realized that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, who would normally build that record, would not be inclined to do so. And so we founded and created the National Commission on Voting Rights, and we did hearings across the country. and created what came to be collectively a 10,000-page record of discrimination in voting, showing that the states that were previously covered should continue to be covered. And that reauthorization was called the Coretta Scott King, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer Voting Rights Act. And one of the reasons why we did all of the work to build the record is because we knew that the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act would be challenged. Its constitutionality would be challenged, as it had been every time it was reauthorized. And of course, 8 days after the signing of the reauthorization, the bill was challenged by a municipal utility district in Texas. And that's the first time I found out there was such a thing as a municipal utility district. And the case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court did not decide on the constitutionality at that time because it used the doctrine of constitutional avoidance to address the question of the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act by finding that the municipal utility district, which I derisively called the mud, did not have standing. And so there was another shot at the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act, and that came from Shelby County, Alabama. And Shelby County, Alabama, this litigation was successful in finding, in the court finding that the formula that determined the constitutionality, the formula that determined who was subject to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. The court did this by applying a new doctrine called equal sovereignty of the states, which had not been used before in voting rights jurisprudence. And the equal sovereignty of the state was before used to talk about each state coming into the union would be equal. But the state, the Supreme Court in 2013 determined that by treating some states differently than others, in fact, by requiring that states with a history of discrimination in voting to submit their voting changes, that violated this equal sovereignty doctrine that had not yet before been applied to the voting rights jurisprudence. And then, even incredibly, Justice Roberts said, yes, there is discrimination in voting, but it's not, and this is me paraphrasing his words, but it's not enough to require the Section 5, and he sent it back to Congress to come up with a different formula. Mind you, what was really distressing to me is that the court never looked at this record that we spent all this time compiling. It basically said, you are requiring the states who were previously under Section 5 to remain under Section 5, and without looking at the why and the authority of Congress to make that determination, decided that the formula was unconstitutional. And since 2013, we have been pushing for Congress to fix the Shelby County decision. And I should note that the Voting Rights Act has always been one of these iconic laws that not only transformed our democracy, but was really bipartisan. All the reauthorizations were signed by Republican presidents. In 2005, it passed 390 to 33 in the House and was unanimously passed in the Senate. And some say it was cynically passed by such great numbers because those who were really opposed to it knew that the Supreme Court was going to take care of it. So Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a really telling reaction to the striking down of the formula and, in effect, the nullification of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And she noted that throwing out the pre-clearance provision, the provision that required federal approval, was like getting rid of your umbrella because you were no longer getting wet in a rainstorm. So you can't make the case that you no longer need the statute because the statute is actually working to stop discrimination. So what immediately followed after the Shelby County decision is that jurisdictions, surprise, the ones with a history of discrimination in voting, passed laws that continued to discriminate. And I want to talk a bit about the Texas photo ID law, because this was actually a law that was passed and implemented, well, passed before the Shelby County decision. And because Texas was then covered under Section 5, it had to submit the voter ID law for federal review. And just a bit about Texas's voter ID law. The law required very specific identification in order to be able to vote. So in addition to your driver's license or your state-issued ID card, it also required concealed carry gun permit as an ID in order to be able to vote, but did not include student identification. So it was very specific about which ID it would allow in order to be able to vote. So it submitted it to the Department of Justice, and DOJ said, no, this is discriminatory. You can't implement it. Because the states at that time had two bites of the apple, they could also submit it to the DC District Court. So after DOJ objected, they went to the DC District Court, and the DC District Court said, no, this law is discriminatory. So Texas could not implement its voter ID law because of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. When the Supreme Court in 2013 essentially nullified the application of the Voting Rights Act by finding the formula that said Texas had to submit its voting changes unconstitutional, that very day, Texas said, remember that voter ID law that was found to be discriminatory? We're going to implement that law. And so the result of that is that 600,000 registered voters in Texas could not vote because they did not have the required ID needed to vote. And so then we had to go under Section 2, which, remember I told you about the Voting Rights Act, to litigate the case. The thing about Section 2 is that it doesn't stop the implementation. So while the litigation is going on, elections are happening, and there are people who aren't able to vote in those elections. And we've got findings of both intentional and impact discrimination because of the photo ID law. And at that time, we were litigating this case along with other civil rights groups and the Department of Justice. And the case, carried on for about 7 years. In 2017, when the new Trump administration came in, it said to the court, because the case was still ongoing because Texas kept appealing every time we won, the Trump administration said, we want to evaluate whether we agree that the Texas law is intentionally discriminatory, and in fact withdrew that support for that claim. The other thing that happened in that time is that we, because elections were happening while this litigation was going on, we had an interim remedy with the state that said if you didn't have the ID but wanted to vote in the 2016 election, that you could sign an affidavit saying you didn't have the ID and you're able to vote. We then had prosecutors in Harris County, Texas said, and we will prosecute you if we think you perjured yourself by saying you didn't have the ID. So of course this had a chilling effect. And then the other thing that happened is that this Texas legislature adopted this interim remedy into law. So then we had to go back to court to fight, because it was supposed to be an interim remedy to allow people to vote at a period of time. It wasn't meant to be the permanent remedy. So we had to go back to court, and unfortunately the court has found that that interim remedy is sufficient. And for us, it was really an education in when you're in the middle of litigation about the remedy that you think would be temporary and how that could become permanently adopted. Oops, I went a bit too, wow, where did I go there? I really went very far there. Okay, so North Carolina. So North Carolina I remember when I started working on voting in 2004, I used to use North Carolina as an example of they have early voting, they have election day registration, you can have your votes counted if you voted the wrong precinct. I was lifting North Carolina up as a beacon of really affirmative, positive voting laws, and then North Carolina was actually waiting out to see what would happen with the Shelby County decision, because they had introduced photo ID law, but they were waiting to see whether they would pass it or not. After the Shelby County decision, North Carolina decided, it's not just photo ID. We're going to get rid of election day administration, voter registration, I'm sorry. We're going to cut back on early voting. We're going to get rid of pre-registration of 16-year-olds, and we're not going to count ballots that were voted in the wrong precincts, which happens quite a lot. So this became known as the North Carolina Monster Voting Law. And again, we partners in North Carolina litigated, and the Fourth Circuit determined that the North Carolina Monster Law was enacted with surgical precision to keep minorities from being able to vote. And this is a finding that the Supreme Court refused to take up when North Carolina tried to appeal to the Supreme Court. So this is really the impact of Section 5, because, as I mentioned, of not having Section 5 in effect, because, as I mentioned, elections are happening while these laws are in effect. So one of the projects I work on is election protection. It's a resource for voters where they can call a suite of hotlines, including the 866 Our Vote hotline that the Lawyers Committee administers. And you can ask for information. I want to confirm my voter registration. Where do I go to vote? Or I'm here to vote and someone is keeping me from being able to vote. And you'll see in 2018, a lot of the issues that we encountered or problems we had to solve had to do with voter registration and polling place problems. And I'm going to talk a bit about what is behind those numbers. So voter registration, the gateway to being able to vote. So we have states that are increasingly making it harder to register to vote. Georgia had a law that is called the exact match law. And they still have this law, but we became aware of exact match when we had a partner in Georgia who was registering voters who weren't getting on the rolls, and they couldn't figure out why not. It took us 2 years of investigation, and we realized that if there was any difference between your voter registration form and your driver's license or social security database, they would not process the voter registration. So I have a hyphenated last name. If I filled out my voter registration form and I didn't put that hyphen, they weren't processing my voter registration. And so we sued the state of Georgia and actually got a settlement saying that you would process these voter registrations within a 24-month period after reaching out to the voter to confirm that yes, they indeed wanted to register. Again, when we first became aware of this, this was just a procedure that the Secretary of State was using. The Georgia legislature enacted exact match into law. And in 2018, you may have heard the news that there were as many as 53,000 eligible voters who couldn't get their registrations processed because they were stuck in this limbo. Now, the thing that becomes really complicated is that it was being reported that 53,000 registered voters can't vote. That wasn't necessarily true. They could vote, but they had to go to the polling place with their ID and show that they could vote. So because of the nuances sometimes with the way laws are being interpreted and what's being reported, that's also a challenge that we face, because there's always a nuance, and it's not just the easy soundbite that we're fighting against. I'm happy to report that in last month, the Georgia legislature actually passed a bill making it easy for those who are caught up in the exact match for them to be able to go to the polls and vote. But new citizens are still have a problem where if you became a citizen after you got your driver's license, even though we had partners who were going to citizenship ceremonies and attaching the citizenship certificate, the naturalization certificate, to the voter registration form, these new Americans were getting these letters saying you're not eligible to vote because you're not a citizen. And they could not simply go to the polling place and have and show their citizenship papers. They had to find a deputy registrar to show it to, who was not always available. So again, we sued. And unfortunately, the impact of the exact match on new citizens was not addressed in the new legislation. So that lawsuit for us continues. And there are other states that are beginning to adopt this exact match process. Voter purges. So in the National Voter Registration Act, which many of you know as motor voter, you go to get your driver's license and they said, oh, do you want to vote? And it also applies to public assistance agencies. If you go to get public assistance, you should be afforded the opportunity to vote. To register to vote. And this bill also has a list maintenance procedure. So it's to help election officials clean up the rolls. If they know someone has moved or someone has died, you can take them off the rolls. We have states now who are aggressively moving to remove people from the list based on faulty data, or in the case of Ohio, for not voting. Now, there's a very explicit provision in the National Voter Registration Act that says you can't remove someone from the voter registration rolls for not voting. This case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and again, before in the Obama administration, it was supporting the plaintiffs in addressing this law. The Trump administration came in and said, no, we are no longer going to support the findings that removing people from the voting rolls for not being able to vote violates the National Voter Registration Act. The Supreme Court in Husted versus APRI actually agreed with Ohio that they can start removing people from the voting rolls for not voting, despite the fact that the NVRA says you can remove people from the voting rolls for not voting, because what Ohio is doing is that it's not removing people from the voting rolls for not voting, it's beginning the process of removing people from the voting rolls for not voting. And there are other states who are beginning this practice. Signature match. We have states that where, you may not know this, but the election officials are also signature experts. And they determine whether absentee ballots are going to count or not by determining whether the signature that's on file matches the signature that is on the absentee ballot form. And of course, our signatures don't change over time, right? And so we have, and you will be shocked and surprised to learn that the determination of whose signature counts and whose doesn't on the absentee ballot forms disproportionately impacts minority voters, where jurisdictions are discounting the absentee ballots of minority voters more than other voters. And in fact, the new bill in Georgia actually takes away a lot of the discretion of election officials to reject absentee ballots because of signatures. And I pick a lot on Georgia because we do a lot of work in Georgia, but there are other states and you should look in your states and determine, and you can call the 866-our vote hotline to ask, how does the state apply these laws? Because it's not just happening in Georgia. Polling place consolidations. So we have, I remember when we were working on the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in Section 5, people would say, but why do we have to send all of our voting changes to the federal government for approval? Why do we have to send our polling place changes? Because jurisdictions, by consolidating polling places, are making it harder for people in certain communities to be able to vote. And since the Shelby County decision, many states are moving to consolidate or close polling places. A very telling example, picking on Georgia again, is that Macon-Bibb County in Georgia moved to have their polling places consolidated, and we were able to show through data crunched by our social scientists that this would have a disproportionate impact on minority voters who didn't have access to transportation, or that you would have 5,000 people to a polling place, which would result in the long lines and the problems at the polling places. In Macon-Bibb County, after we pushed back against them closing their polling place, we learned from our partners there that they were told that they needed to fix a polling place in the minority neighborhood, and what they were going to do when they closed down this polling place was to move the polling to the sheriff's office. And the community pushed back against that because, African American community, the sheriff's office, why wouldn't they feel welcome there? And the county resisted. And we were able to find a provision in the Georgia Code that said if the community could sign, would have the members of the precinct, a considerable percentage, I can't remember the exact number, sign a petition, said they wanted the polling place to be moved to a particular location, then election officials had to do that. So the community scrambled over a weekend and got the signatures necessary to move the polling place to the church that they wanted it to be moved to rather than the sheriff's office. And no community should have to go to such extraordinary lengths in order to be able to vote. Polling place changes. Again, one of the great things about that Section 5 provided was notice of changes anytime there was a voting change. So people can be, and then what the DOJ would do is reach out to the community and says, are you aware of this particular change? When polling places are moved without notification of those in the community, then people are either showing up at the wrong place to vote. And then let's talk about, opportunities to vote. On election day, which is not a holiday, you can vote maybe before you go to work, if you work close to where you live, around lunchtime or after work. If you show up at where you think you can vote and that, the polling place isn't there, and this is your only opportunity that day in order to be able to vote, it could really have an impact on whether you can cast a ballot or not. So this is an area that may seem innocuous, but our information that's really important to ensure that there's access to the ballot. And then poll workers. I just want to encourage all of you in this room, if you can, to be a poll worker. The poll workers are the gateway to the ballot. We need poll workers who are pro-voter and who are actually there to help voters to be able to cast the ballot, and not those who feel that they're ICE officials or determined based on your language ability whether you should be able to vote or not. And also, there are poll workers who don't get the sufficient training that they need in order to be able to vote, particularly if you're in a jurisdiction where the law changes all the time. Or I heard that this thing called voter ID, it must be in my state too, so whether your state has a voter ID law or not, I'm going to ask for a voter ID, or I'm only going to ask certain voters for voter ID. So this is something that we encounter as well. And then the other challenge that we encounter is the late opening of polling places. And as I mentioned, if you only have a limited opportunity in order to be able to vote, if your polling place opens late, and sometimes they open late because they didn't have enough poll workers, or people who said they would be poll workers didn't show up. So it's not just the laws that are keeping people from being able to vote, but there's also resources that can keep people from being able to vote. Voter assistance. Again, are polling places and jurisdictions following the law? Are they providing that minority language assistance? Are they providing the opportunity for those who are disabled to be able to vote? Provisional ballots. Both in Florida and Georgia in 2018, provisional ballots played a really big role in determining the outcome of those elections. So a provisional ballot is basically you show up to vote, and for some reason, there's a question about your eligibility to vote. After 2000, you remember Florida, and the 537 votes that determined the election, and there was also an issue of people who showed up to vote but were turned away because they were deemed ineligible. One of the things that Congress did was pass the Help America Vote Act that said, if someone shows up and says that they should be able to vote, you have to provide them a provisional ballot. One of the things that Harvard didn't do, however, was say how provisional ballots should be counted. So you have states like Florida that if you show up in the wrong precinct and you're given a provisional ballot, that ballot is not going to count. That's why it's so important to know about polling place changes. Because if I vote in the wrong place, and I'm given a provisional ballot, that's not going to count. And because our elections are so close more and more, it really has an impact about whether those ballots are going to be counted or not. And you see, often, far too many are not counted. Voting machines. We have a very, very old voting infrastructure. We need to update our voting machines. We need the resources to update those machines. And then now we have, for states that have electronic voting machines, we have the concern about whether those machines can be hacked or tampered with. And there's a big fight again in Georgia where they're trying to, they passed the law to buy particular electronic voting machines without a paper trail. When you have a lack of confidence in our elections coupled with the opportunity for elections to be, or machines to be hacked, it undermines voter confidence in our elections and in our democracy. Voter intimidation, deceptive practices. When I first started doing voting work, the particular deceptive practice on the right used to be in flyers in neighborhoods. It's going to be a big turnout election, so here's what we're going to do. Republicans are going to vote on Tuesdays and Democrats are going to vote on Wednesday. And it's now moved online. And so it's not only people being harassed or calls to the hotline saying, oh, I showed up to vote and there are people in front of my polling place with guns and I'm afraid, but also misinformation about voting. And then there's voter apathy. In 2016, there were 93 million eligible voters who didn't vote. And so there are many reasons why people don't register and why they don't vote. I talked about some of them. You know, it makes it really hard for them to get access. So it's something that we really need help with. Felony disfranchisement laws. There's 6 million people in our communities right now who can't vote because of felony disfranchisement laws. In Florida, they passed Amendment 4 in 2018. It was a fantastic victory, which would allow 1.4 million people in Florida to be able to vote. But wait. Now the legislature, even though those who wrote the amendment were very clear, if you were no longer in jail, you couldn't register and vote, the legislature is saying no. They are saying you have to have paid all your penalties and restitution, which is not in the amendment. And they're also redefining the crimes that fall under the exception. So you can vote if, except for those who were convicted of murder or sexual offenses. Now they're redefining those to bring more people under those exceptions, and that's the current fight that's happening now. So every time there's a step forward, so how do we fix this? Or how do we start addressing these? H.R. 1, For the People Act, it's a bill that's being pushed by the Democratic majority in the House. They wanted to make it their first priority. And this is what I call a democracy bill, because it's not just about voting rights. It doesn't just provide automatic voter registration, early voting opportunities, provide those with felony convictions to be able to vote, but it also addresses campaign finance, disclosures, and ethics in governance. It's over 500 pages. It passed the House, unfortunately, on a partisan lines, and now it's before the Senate, and it's Senate Bill 949. And the sad challenge that we're facing now is that election reform, voting reform is seen as a partisan issue. We need to push back against that. It's a people issue. Our democracy. It's about our democracy and not about parties. But this is something that I urge you to push for your senators to vote for and push back against that partisan rhetoric when it comes to voting. And then there's the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and this is the bill to fix the Shelby County decision. It's currently been introduced in both the House and Senate. Something that's really, really sad for me right now is that even the Voting Rights Act is being embroiled in this partisan frame. We need to reject that. This is one of the most important bills we've passed. I hope I made the case that it transformed our democracy in very significant ways, and I urge you to push for the support of that bill as well. And we can't do this fight without you. So I'm really glad that you're made voting rights and how we can address voting rights together one of your priorities, and I look forward to answering any questions you have later on. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So that was a phenomenal layout recap of all of the ways that U.S. citizens have had to struggle and fight throughout history for our government and for our institutions to respect our human dignity and civil rights and the dignity of all of our citizens. And so actually, I'm here to speak on the international asks, which we are seeking to do actually a similar thing through those. So in the international section, you've got two components. So there's the Human Rights Commission, seeking for the Senate to have a Human Rights Commission, much like the Tom Landos Commission in the House. And then I'm here, again, to speak on the Global Fragility Act specifically. So I should note that I'm here on behalf of a very broad coalition. So I represent the Alliance for Peacebuilding, which is a network of over 100 organizations seeking to reduce violence and build peace in the world. But I work with Mercy Corps and a coalition of over 55 organizations in support of this bill as well. So I'm here to sort of lay out some of the components of it and also why it's so needed. And I should note also in that coalition, we have many faith-based organizations, some of whom are here today, and that has been an incredible component of bringing this legislation to bear. Louder, yes. Bring it closer. Perfect. So, what is global fragility, first of all? So this bill has actually gone through several names. It's focused on violence reduction, root causes of conflict, global stability, different components. We settled on global fragility as a lens because it's the most comprehensive. So if you aren't familiar, fragile states and the idea of fragility is something that institutions have been using for a few years now. Places like the World Bank, the OECD, and increasingly the US government have come to take on this frame. And what it means at its core, it has a few different definitions, but basically it consists of the idea that a state's level of fragility relates to its vulnerability to or inability to recover from major shocks. So these can include things that we traditionally think of, like an environmental disaster, a humanitarian crisis, an economic downturn, and increasingly violent conflict. So it's something that's very important to the peace building and conflict resolution communities, but fragility is a little bit more comprehensive in what it means. And so at its core, it's referring to a breakdown in the social contract. So much like we heard earlier in the US, the ways that the social contract matters and sort of the relationship between citizens and their state is, directly related to sort of the stability in that area. That's something that we are looking at increasingly worldwide. And the reason why this is useful and the reason why we're so encouraged by this framework is because increasingly, the hot spots in the world and the places where we're paying the most attention to and the places that need the most help from outside are not necessarily those that are the most poor or even those that are experiencing violent conflict in the way we traditionally think of it. So when you think about a place like Yemen, which is absolutely the world's worst humanitarian disaster right now, there is a famine affecting millions of people. There are children, millions of children starving to death every day. That's a man-made crisis. And I think, 10, 15 years ago, I think very few of us could have assumed that Yemen would be the place with the most urgent need. I think Syria is a very similar story. And we're seeing more and more and more that the most fragile places in the world are not necessarily those at the lowest of the poverty list. So while we're certainly still paying attention to things like global poverty and other needs in those ways, it's a more complicated picture, and the US government needs to get up to speed a little bit more on how it addresses those. You may have also seen that, I think this weekend, I think today is actually the 25th anniversary of the start of the Rwandan genocide. And if you recall, the US had a pretty slow and ultimately disappointing response to that. And so in those 25 years, a few elements have been put into place sort of throughout the US government. There are little pieces, boards, trainings from different people, but there's no overarching way that we seek to address and prevent these types of crises, both from the moral standpoint and also from the economic and national security standpoint. So, in any given fragile state, any given sort of developing country in the world, we often have the U.S. Department of State that is the lead on diplomacy, so it handles things like peace processes and dealing with diplomats, and our ambassadors are there and all of that. The U.S. Agency for International Development does incredible work across education, health, water, some small conflict mitigation and peacebuilding programs, but often much larger programs focused specifically on, economic issues, health issues that may or may not have to be responsive to any level of violence or conflict in the area. And then often, and I think we're hearing more and more, where also the Department of Defense is present in a lot of places in the world. And we often hear about that only when something goes wrong, like in Niger recently. So increasingly, we're seeing that we have all these different U.S. components in these countries that may or may not be responsive to each other or have any need to coordinate with each other or even any authority to work together. And that's actually something sort of in the more wonky details that this law is seeking to address and make sure that they're required to coordinate and that our U.S. foreign policy toward particular states is actually lines up and makes sense sort of comprehensively. So that's some of the why, the sort of background on the bill. And some of the other elements laid out in your talking points are why we need this act. So according to the World Bank, violence and violent conflict are the leading causes of displacement worldwide. So we're actually, last year, UNHCR counted that there are 68.5 million people forcibly displaced in the world. It's the highest level ever recorded, highest level since World War II. Year after year, it's going up. And actually, when you dig through those numbers, it's year after year, the same 5 places that people are coming from. Think about adding one more crisis to that list, and it just exponentially goes up. So when we hear about migration, we hear about the crisis. When we hear about how Europe and we are interacting with this, it's not necessarily people who are fleeing sort of humanitarian environmental disasters in the way that we hear about them. Certainly there is famine, certainly there are the sort of traditional issues, but actually often these are man-made issues. forced by violence and violent conflict, and that's something that the U.S. needs to be responsive to, not just from sort of the moral, ethical standpoint of these refugees, but thinking about how we are interacting in the violence and conflict, and what our diplomacy role can be there as well. So it's driving 80% of humanitarian needs, and so sort of the traditional sort of non-man-made crises are less and less of what we're seeing. Again, U.S. foreign policy and assistance efforts in highly violent and fragile states too often prioritize responding to immediate needs rather than solving the problems that cause them or tend to escalate violence in the area. So most of our response is targeted towards, say, humanitarian assistance. That's essential. Life-saving assistance is incredibly important. Saving people's lives, keeping them alive is critical. However, often we only focus on those issues and not necessarily reducing violence in the area or preventing further violence that is going to cause even more people to need this assistance. So we need to recalibrate some of these efforts and think about them more holistically and more sustainably, so we're not here year after year after year in the same places. And again, the Global Fragility Act would advance the values of human dignity, just peace, conflict transformation, solidarity, participatory processes, and nonviolent peacemaking, while helping the U.S. government do a better job of addressing the root causes of violent conflict. So this is what I think is so amazing about your group, and we're so thrilled to be on your agenda and to be able to speak to you, as I think you have a real sort of agency over this issue, and to be able to make that argument of why it matters to advance the values of human dignity, not just in the way that we heard in our own country, but if this is something we believe in, we need to do it abroad as well, and make it easier for people to uphold their own values in their own lives. So that's a lot of the why. So to get to the what, because I know that's a little wonky and a little tricky to think about. So this GFA would launch the first ever whole of government strategy. So it would have the State Department in the lead with the coordination of USAID, with some coordination and a supporting role of the Department of Defense, knowing that they are there and they need to be aware of what's going on, but that they're there to be supportive of the diplomacy and development efforts in the area. So a whole of government strategy to address the risks of fragility by stabilizing conflict-affected areas and preventing violent conflict globally. So what it would do first is it would require the interagency to identify where fragility poses the greatest threats to civilian security and select countries or regions where the U.S. government will pilot innovative diplomatic and programmatic action. So we are not necessarily laying out which countries they should select. So if you're asked about that, feel free to give examples. If you've lived in or worked in a particular fragile or developing state in the world, chances are violence impacts the people there, so feel free to speak to that. We think it could apply lots of different places. Certainly peace builders think often of places sort of in sub-Saharan Africa that are deeply affected both by poverty and violence. But when you think about it, and when you apply the lens of fragility, you come up with a much broader list. So places like the Northern Triangle in Central America, we heard recently the administration seeks to cut off funding to those areas based on the assumption that they're somehow sending their citizens up to immigrate to the U.S., when in fact, they're fleeing the highest levels of violence in the world. And so this lens is really helpful. This bill would be really helpful in requiring the administration to think differently and saying, if there's the highest levels of homicides in the entire world because of gang violence and narco trafficking, but it's not necessarily a conflict zone in the way that we've thought about it traditionally, it still matters, and we should still be applying lessons there and collecting what data we can to think about that, connected with Boko Haram in Nigeria, connected with places in the Middle East, places in Asia that are affected by the same problems. So it would require them to select those countries. And then through a 10-year interagency strategy would require them to approve its ability to measure, evaluate, and assess efforts to prevent violence and fragility. This is essential. We know so little about what the U.S. actually does in these places, how our development and diplomacy and very well-intentioned taxpayer-funded efforts actually impact the violence and fragility there. So the monitoring and evaluation piece is essential, and I think it's something that the Hill offices will be very interested in making sure that they're being effective and using your and my tax dollars the most effectively. And then finally, sort of, basic things like reporting back to Congress and to the public on a biennial basis on which tools are most effective. And then authorizing existing funds. This is something we're very excited about this year. For the first time, there will be funding that's already in the budget. It's been in the budget for several years. It's nothing new, but that will be tied to this effort for the first time. So that's essential as well to make sure it takes hold, and that both sort of overall in these fragile and violence affected countries, that our whole strategy is hopefully more holistically directed toward reducing violence, and all of our health and education and water programs are taking into consideration what conflict has to do in these areas, but then also there's some additional funding to make sure we have things like dialogue, peace building, conflict transformation programs there. So that's some of what the bill would actually do. Some of the other details that the offices might be interested in tomorrow is that this bill has been reintroduced this year. So on the Senate side, it's S727. The lead co-sponsors are Senator Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, and Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina. We're very happy that we've gotten up to 11 sponsors now. So we also have senators on from Oregon, Florida, Indiana, Wisconsin, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Maryland, Colorado, and Pennsylvania. So really incredible, very bipartisan list there. On the House side, it is H.R. 1580. And we've got 6 sponsors. So the lead sponsors are Elliot Engel of New York and Mike McCall from Texas. And those are, if you don't know, the chairman and ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So incredibly powerful group who can really move it through that committee. And we're very proud of their very bipartisan efforts on these issues. You're seeing them talk about prevention more and more and more across different areas. We also have members on from Washington, Missouri, Massachusetts, and Florida. Again, very bipartisan, very across the country issue. Everyone can agree on it. And then just additional background, last session, the previous version, the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act, so longer name, passed the House by a vote of 376 to 16, so pretty incredible support there. So that's a great thing to mention. We do think it'll move pretty quickly on the House side. We think it could go to a markup in the House Foreign Affairs Committee this Tuesday. Actually, it's not yet on the list, but we think it will be taken up and then could be voted on very quickly. So we think it's something that will move. We think it's exciting both for this particular bill, but I think the broader sort of messaging piece for you to get in front of your representatives and say, I care about global fragility, I care about preventing violent conflict is an incredible thing. We often hear from these offices that, well, we know, we get it, we understand, but our constituents don't actually care about foreign policy. They don't care about these places. And that's simply not true. And so it's incredible for you to get in front of them, make the argument for why this matters to you if you're connected to a particular fragile state or you understand sort of the impacts of violence in the world, and just the core message of human dignity. And if we believe that our citizens deserve dignity and human rights, we must believe that for the rest of the world as well. And it's to everyone's benefit. So we'll have a workshop this afternoon as well, and I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions, but hopefully that helps you get a little more background on this bill. And if there are other ways you want to get involved, join us on social media, hashtag Global Fragility Act, or writing a letter to your editor, things like that are really, really helpful. But again, we're just incredibly grateful to be here. It's so wonderful to have you speaking on these issues, and thank you so much.
My goodness. Let's thank our presenters for a really informative session. Okay, so we're going to we have some time for questions. They're both up here. The microphone is roving. And in the interest, Mark, there's one right here. In the interest of time, so a couple of things. One, a reminder from yesterday, which I'm sure you remember, please ask a question. Please ask a question. And please make it brief. And as an incentive, I am from New York. Amen. Nobody wants to see that. So please make it brief. And we have a little bit of wiggle room in our schedule before you get your lunch and go to your breakouts. So we have a little wiggle room, so nobody be anxious, okay? All right. So ready for first question. Thank you.
Thank you. This question is for Marcia. Why did the Supreme Court not look at the 10,000 pages that the lawyer committee created? Because obviously, to me, that is part of the whole thing.
I have the very same question. I think that one of the reasons that we were really concerned and really worked very hard to put the record together is that we knew that we were at a stage in our democracy right now where extraordinary remedies, as the one that was created under Section 5, are being questioned, because we're not looking at you can't vote because you're a minority, right? What I tried to lay out is that it's the impact of seemingly neutral laws, and you're looking at the disproportionate impact. And so when you're moving from explicit denial to looking at the impact, it's something that is a challenging case for us to make in our jurisprudence. But we are now, again, compiling that record, and part of our renewed advocacy in the litigation that we're sure to come after the passage of the fix is to focus in and move the court's attention to looking at that record. So I don't know why they didn't do it, but I have, a long list of suspicions.
Thank you. Next question right here, please.
I've actually got two short questions. First of all, for Marcia, are there two? Have you taken a position on the proposal to do away with the Electoral College? And the other question has to do with the proposal to make Election Day a holiday. If you make it a holiday, since there are a lot of people who work on holidays anyway, does that really address the problem? Thank you.
So my organization has not taken a position on the Electoral College. It's very complicated, and I think it really needs a deep look at what the implications would be. But I think it's worth studying and should be studied. Election Day as a holiday is something that you will see that is not part of H.R. 1 that was voted out. And because there are concerns about who would get to take advantage of the holiday, my position is that there should be all opportunities available to be able to vote, including a holiday, but also in the bill, there's a robust early voting period. And so a combination of Election Day holiday and early voting should be one in which we can ensure that everyone has the opportunity to be able to vote.
Thank you. Here and then here.
Hi, thank you. I want to address my question to Laura. Thank you for your work, both of you. I just came back from a delegation to Honduras, and we spoke with many, many different people across a broad spectrum, including interfaith and ecumenical workers. And we looked at root causes. So I'm curious about how what you're promoting and what you're working towards intersects with the Berta Cáceres work around HR 1299. In particular, we noted that the violence that people are fleeing may be called gang violence, but there are root causes below that. So can you speak a little bit more about, when we hear gang violence, and it's really way more than that. So if you can, I would love to hear about that intersection.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I can't speak to the resolution you mentioned specifically, but I'd love to learn more about it. We, of course, address all of the countries in the world, so don't always know the individual resolutions. Root causes, thank you so much for that. So much of the core of what we are trying to do through this bill and beyond is to get the U.S. government to think much more about prevention and understanding root causes. So thank you so much. And you're right that we hear things like gang violence, but it's actually much lower than that. And something that I didn't mention actually was terrorism and violent extremism, which is something that you'll see and maybe hear in the offices speaking about, that a lot of some of the attention and some of the interest in this bill and this type of initiative is to prevent terrorism in the world, which I think we can understand is, at its core, I think we would agree with, but I think there are some different political implications of that and why the members are specifically involved. For us, it's a way to get a foot in the door for a lot of members who I think are interested in the national security component of these things, and then to get down into the layers and say, well, if you care about national security, you need to care about people in the world feeling like they have dignity and that their government cares about them. So yes, you're right. We are finding more and more and more. We don't have as much evidence as we want, but increasingly evaluations are finding that at the core of both things like terrorism as well as gang violence, as well as, say, white nationalism here in the U.S. and elsewhere, are the same grievances, actually. And often the ideology and sort of the core elements and certainly any sort of faith elements are actually less significant than core feelings of things like isolation, marginalization, feeling like you don't have a voice, feeling like you don't matter, and wanting to be part of something. And so that's certainly true, I think, for a lot of people who end up participating in perhaps gang violence or even what we would call violent extremism. Is at its core, it's a much deeper sort of human issue, and we're working every day to get the U.S. government to understand that and to have its programming reflect much further upstream in those ways. So thank you for bringing that up.
Next here, and then this side of the room.
Peter Cook, New York State Council of Churches. I have two brief questions, one for each of you. First of all, what is the main opposition to that gets articulated against the global act that we're talking about? And the second question is, with the restoration of preclearance under the Voting Rights Section 5, how is that being reworked? For instance, we have voter suppression and problems in New York, which aren't on that original list. How is that thing being revised? So those two questions.
Sure. So first to the opposition. So we don't hear a lot of vocal opposition to the idea of the Global Fragility Act and similar initiatives. We work most often with offices that are familiar with foreign policy, national security issues, so they seem to understand it. I think the most sort of obvious point is the funding, and people don't want to invest more funding in these types of things, to which we often say that prevention is actually significantly more cost effective. We have evidence suggesting that for every dollar we spend trying to prevent conflict, we could actually save 16. Other estimates have it, $7. So it's pretty safe to say that it's more effective to invest a bit more now. We know now that the U.S. has spent nearly $6 trillion in the war on terror, and yet it's still a problem, and prevention is still not there. And so that would be the one key ask that I think we get. But you might be speaking with members who are less familiar with these types of issues, so we'd love to hear feedback from you. But mostly, it's a very bipartisan issue, and it's something that a lot of people have been excited to get behind.
So first, I would say that New York had 3 counties that were previously covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. But what the VRAA does, it looks 25 years back at the history of discrimination in states or jurisdictions. And what does that history look like? They look at objections that the Department of Justice found to previously introduced voting laws. And then it also looks at the litigation under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and findings of discrimination both intentional and impact discrimination. And if you had 15, I think it's 10 statewide or 15 cumulative statewide and from particular jurisdictions, then you would come under Section 5 coverage. It also has a provision called the known practices coverage. And what that does is looks at what are the practices that likely lead to discrimination and require that the jurisdictions or the state to provide notice of those coverages, and that there would be an assessment made by the Department of Justice and private parties making the case about whether those are discriminatory or not and shouldn't be implemented. And then there's also a heightened injunction standard so that practices that were found previously to be discriminatory, that when we try to have them enjoined in litigation that we're going to bring forward, that the court has a broader injunction standard to stop those while they're being litigated. So those are the main provisions under the new Voting Rights Advancement Act. And there's also the Voting Rights Amendment Act, which was introduced by Congressman Sensenbrenner, and that's the Republican bill. I saw that it was introduced. I have yet to see the text. But in the past, that tracked the Advancement Act, but included a carve-out for violations found for voter ID laws. So that's the main difference between those two bills.
Okay, I see a question here, 3 others here. I saw at least 2 here, but right now we're gonna go here in the olive, and then there's a young woman in the back in the white.
I'll try to address this to both of you, but possibly
Can you use the mic?
Johnson Blanco,
Can you use the mic?
Esquire. You can tell I have a brother, so I have to give all the proper honor she's due. Number one, are there any specific, you've given some examples on reduction of the number of voting places or changing them often and those kinds of things, which certainly I would agree are discriminatory. I'm in South Carolina, Georgia line, man, I know Elbert County just went from 14 to 2. And it wasn't the sheriff's office, it was something like that. I'm curious about that. Is there any particular laws or pressure to states on that? The second half, is there anything to help with the required training, maybe for workers? I'm a clerk in Greenville County. We're doing just the opposite. We're going from 150 to 155 by 2020, so we're adding 5 more there, but we also are required to do 2 trainings, one a state training plus a local training. Are there anything that would require that? Or movements to try to help states required to do some of that stuff?
Yeah. So it's a great point you raised about, what we can do in our state legislatures to push back against these laws. And there are reforms being advocated for in states, whether it's automatic voter registration or early expansion of early voting. So yes, we should also, I know you're here to engage with the federal government, but also look at how you can engage in your states. And we, the Lawyers Committee and part of the Election Protection Coalition, we actually are putting together what we call pro-voter poll worker guides to work as a supplement to what is provided by jurisdictions, because I actually convinced my mom to be a poll worker and then realized that election day happened during when school was out, and then she couldn't babysit my kids, and it was a conflict there. But but I do know that there's a lot that is needed to train poll workers, and you have about 4 hours and a huge binder. So whatever we in the civil rights community and the election protection community can do to supplement that, we are working towards doing that as well.
Thank you.
The work that each of you are doing is very impressive, and I'm grateful. I'm wondering how you are funded, and if we should ask our legislators to increase your funding, if you're government funding, or if this is an opportunity for which you're seeking personal donations.
Won't say no. No, so specifically the Alliance for Peacebuilding that I work for is a network organization, so we get dues from our members. We are not government funded. We don't specifically run programs. I advocate on behalf of our members, but certainly the other members of the coalition, like Mercy Corps, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, those types of organizations are the ones that implement a lot of these programs on behalf of the U.S. government. So yes, the funding that is tied to these initiatives, which is not new funding, it's already in the pot, which is important, but would be tied to this type of work. Yes, they do get funded for that, but all of them, accept other individual donations to conduct some very innovative peace building and conflict resolution work and that type of thing. So there's lots of great organizations. There's lots of faith-based organizations to get involved with, which you may already be.
Okay, we're gonna come to this side of the room, then back over here, and then I see you in the middle. Also, please know that both presenters have time afterwards that they will be up here. But next.
Thank you and good morning. Buenos días. Ángel Rivera Agosto. I am the Area Executive for Latin America and the Caribbean at Global Ministries. And my question is for Laura. The Global Fragility Act, what is the intersection on this project with the right of self-determination of the people around the world, taking into account the awful record of US intervention in different countries around the world, military interventions, even protecting the interests of private enterprises around the world and so forth. So I just want to know the intersection of this act regarding those terrible situations and history. Thank you. Blessings.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Yes, it's very intersected. That's very much sort of the end goal. And so certainly while in a lot of these fragile places where the U.S. is very involved, this act seeks to redirect somewhat the U.S. foreign policy toward them, toward a partnership model. And so that's what we're hoping for. So you see language on things like compact-based. Increasingly, other elements of the U.S. Foreign policy are seeking to do that, to allow these countries to move towards self-determination. It's tricky where some of the governments we're talking about don't necessarily have the interests of their citizens at heart. And so this seeks to partner where we can, measure which countries have the best capacity to start leading these issues on their own, and move toward self-reliance in that way. And then also in other places work with the citizens to build out their civil society is a really critical part of this, in working with local civil society for citizens to build up their own capacity to address peace and conflict issues as well as other development issues there. So it's sort of on a country by country basis, but certainly the end goal is towards self-reliance.
Thank you.
My question is similar,
Okay.
and it's on the international ask. I recognize I'm not very educated about how this all works. I don't see why this ask is in the right direction. I don't know why we would want Congress to be deciding the fragility of states. I realize our State Department is decimated right now, but I don't see why we're asking this to be moved from where I think it currently is, maybe I'm wrong about that, over to the congressional side. I don't understand why that's the right direction for us.
So what it's seeking to do is to have Congress take its oversight position over the administration, and to require the administration, because this is what the administration carries forth, better coordinate where it is. And I certainly understand what you mean by the State Department being decimated by, we don't have appointees in a lot of the places that deal with conflict and peace in the world. But at the same time, we have this opportunity, and there is a lot of momentum in Congress toward thinking more about preventing conflict, and the ways that we can do that within our own capacities. And so we're also partnering with other governments and the UN to think about how to interact with that as well. So definitely take your point, but we're doing what we can to sort of move within the administration that we have and move it toward a better solution. And that, this, if enacted, it would actually require a year-long planning stage, and then it would be implemented over 10 years. So we're looking ahead across future administrations and looking at the trends in the world and the places that are going to be most fragile, and that the U.S. will still need to interact with them. And so we're looking ahead to put the things in place that we need to sort of reverse the trends that we're seeing.
Where's the microphone over here? Can you bring it right here, please? Can you help him by standing up? Thank you.
My question, two very short, I promise. The first one is on the international ask, and a lot of the problems we see with international violence is not related necessarily to whether or not we recognize there's international violence, but whether there's the political will to do something about it, like in the case of Rwanda. So my question is whether or not the bill requires any kind of action. And I'm not sure I understand the bill because I'm still reading through the materials. So whether that act requires any kind of action by this commission, or if they simply just report back to Congress. And then my second question on voting rights is, can you talk a little bit about how gerrymandering has impacted voting rights, and whether or not we should stop putting our hope in the Supreme Court to deliver us from voting rights problems because they keep punning on things like Gill v. Whitford?
Sure. So specifically for the Global Fragility Act, I think that might not necessarily address that issue, but I think on the Human Rights Commission, of which I'm not necessarily an expert, and other parallel efforts, including the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act that passed last year, that we were involved in as well. So there are other efforts toward getting the U.S. to better act when necessary and respond to these issues. And by setting up the Atrocities Prevention Board or any successor and that sort of thing. And that's one piece of this bill that I'm working on, and something that we're paying attention to, but not specifically that would be addressed. And so, but again, this is a way for us to, I think, get toward that type of idea. And so for a lot of the members we're working with who are fairly skeptical of these concepts just a few years ago, I think are now starting to really speak about the ideas of both prevention, but then also response where necessary. So I think it's something that's a great messaging piece, and that's great for you to be reminding your representatives that you care about. And so we welcome your ideas on getting us more towards a place where we can do that.
Could I just, I know you're getting ready to speak to that issue, but will you also include in your response the current Supreme Court case that is two cases, one from North Carolina, one from Maryland? The North Carolina one is exactly the same issue as the one in Maryland, but North Carolina, it's Republican gerrymandering, and Maryland, it's Democrat gerrymandering. So, thank you.
So before I answer the gerrymandering questions, which are very big questions, I will get in trouble with my executive director if I also didn't answer the funding question. So we are funded through foundations and also donations by our board, as well as we have a big dinner. If anyone is interested in supporting the work of the Lawyers Committee, please visit us at lawyerscommittee.org. Now on to the gerrymandering question. So there are two types of gerrymandering. There's racial gerrymandering and there's partisan gerrymandering. And gerrymandering speaks to something that we haven't, is part of voting, but I didn't mention before, the census. So next year we will be filling out the census, and part of the count we'll be looking at whether our congressional, state legislative, municipal districts have equal populations. And so all of those bodies will be redrawing lines in 2021 based on the census data. And how the lines are drawn can really have an impact of being able to elect your candidate of choice. So if you draw the lines in such a way that you either pack all the minorities in a particular district so you could only vote for, one person of choice, or whether you make the opportunities available across the board to allow more opportunity to vote for racial minorities. So there are two things with racial gerrymandering. It's called packing and cracking. Either you put all the minorities in one district, so instead of being able to vote for candidates of choice in 2 out of 6 or 3 out of 6, you can only vote for your candidate of choice in 1 out of 6 because you're all packed into a particular district. Or you crack. You separate out and put very few in many districts where I mentioned racially polarized voting. If the white population votes to collectively against, and the minority community won't have the opportunity to vote for their candidate of choice. And so that's one form of gerrymandering that happens, and there have been cases in Virginia and North Carolina that speak to Alabama since the last redistricting that speak to that. And then there's partisan gerrymandering, which Gil v. Wickford was mentioned, as well as the North Carolina and Maryland case. And what that speaks to is drawing your district lines as such that even if, for example, in Wisconsin, where the Democrats got a majority of the overall vote, they only got 1/3 of the seats because of the way the district lines were drawn. And so the court is now looking at the question of whether partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. And one of the things that the court is grappling with is how do you determine the level of partisanship that would say that gets you to the unconstitutional question. And then that gets caught up in questions about proportional representation, which is verboten in our jurisprudence. And so how do you decide, is it I get a majority of the votes, but I only get 40% of the seats, or I get a majority of the votes, I only get 30% of the seats? In Gil v. Whitford, the plaintiffs there came up with a formula, math, which, we all become lawyers because we try to avoid math, and they wanted the court to determine, it was a formula called the efficiency gap, and to figure out how efficient the votes were, and the court sort of punted on that. But since the 90s, we lawyers have been trying to come up with a test for the court to apply to find partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional, and we'll see whether in both the North Carolina and Maryland case, the court applies the tests that have been put forward. And it says if it's extreme, but then how do you define extreme? And there are some certain tests that the lawyers there have suggested to the court. And then there's also this backpedaling by the court that says, because the court found that the question of whether it decides gerrymandering was a justiciable question. It's something that could be cited by the court and not a political question. And now there seems to be some backtracking on, is this really something that we should be involved in, or is it really a political question? And then Justice Gorsuch was pointing to a lot of the ballot initiatives that had the redistricting reform in the 2018 election to say, well, maybe we have this decided through ballot initiatives, but then the parties did point out that not all states allow for ballot initiatives. And then you're looking at the legislature, and it's not, if I'm elected under the current system, then it's not in my interest to try to change the current system to make it more fair. So it really is something that the court needs to figure out and grapple with, and that's what we're trying to do ahead of the 2021 redistricting cycle. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. This is going to be the last question. I apologize to say. I see that there are several hands still, so we have a couple of options. As I said, our presenters have some time to be here if you would like to talk to them individually. Also, you can use the open space time as an opportunity to have these discussions, as well as in the state breakouts. Okay, I see you. Last question.
This goes to the global ask, particularly about the name of the title. It seems to me, even in your responses, the fundamental problem is the authorization of the use of military force in 2001 that has put us in a state of endless war. And so instead of working around the fringes of trying to pick up what the U.S. is doing around the world, when are we going to take an initiative on ending endless war? That should be our ask.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. On the name, we have gone through several names, and this was the sort of global stability, which carried a lot of other connotations with it, global violence reduction, which didn't carry a lot of weight on the Hill. So completely understand that. I think fragility is sort of a tricky word, but it's what we settled on. I think on the AUMF issue, absolutely, there are peace builders working to repeal and possibly replace that issue. Specifically, what this bill is seeking to do is address some of the places that have been impacted by the global war on terror and stabilize and actually move them much more toward a stable environment, but then also really prevent the next series of endless wars. And so I think it's definitely a related issue, but it's somewhat parallel, and that it's actually trying to look at the places that are at the most risk, whether or not that's related to the U.S. foreign policy toward them, and prevent them from becoming the places that we're talking about in 5 years. And so absolutely understand your point, and I think it's something that we'll continue to work on in other ways. And I think this is really opening the door on political will for a lot of the members who don't usually think about these issues to start thinking toward the impacts of endless war and preventing the next one. Thank you.
Oh, and just really quickly before we end, the Lawyers Committee is part of a coalition called Lawyers and Callers that we organize along with Sojourners. If any one of you are interested in hearing more about that, you can Google Lawyers and Callers. I think it's lawyersandcallers.org, but I'm not 100% sure. Or follow up with me and I'll share more information with you about that as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.